Welcome to Pacific States University's online lecture series for Gen 108, Explorations in the Arts. Today, we are diving into the mechanical crucible of the avant-garde, where rapid technological acceleration completely fractured the traditional artistic worldview. I mean, just picture a classic, heavy military locomotive violently shattering into translucent, overlapping geometric facets right in front of you. By 1907, the traditional way of looking at the world, it was entirely broken. Sure, Fallism had already unleashed a chaotic storm of wild colors, and German Expressionism had exposed a deeply anxious human psyche. But as the clock ticked closer and closer to the fateful year of 1914, a new breed of artists looked around and realized that it wasn't just human emotion that had changed. Space, time, reality itself had fundamentally fractured. Let's explore exactly how that happened.
I want you, as students of cultural history, to really consider a crucial question here. How on earth did artists manage to predict the unprecedented horrors of the First World War? Well, to understand this, we have to look at the massive technological shifts occurring right beneath their feet. Imagine living in an era where, suddenly out of nowhere, X-rays are invented. That's technology that can literally see through solid human bone. Picture the massive rise of factories mass-producing identical steel parts by the millions, and high-speed locomotives completely blurring the landscape in ways the human eye had literally never experienced before. These incredible, early 20th century technologies fundamentally shattered humanity's fixed perception of space, time, and reality, long before the first shots of 1914 were ever fired. The artists we're studying today? They were essentially the early warning radar for this massive societal earthquake.
Part 1. Cubism and Spatial Anxiety.
So, let's head to Paris, 1907. Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque realized that 400 years of traditional linear perspective was frankly a static illusion. They recognized that the old way of painting was practically a lie, and they set out to invent an entirely new visual language for a rapidly changing world. They were essentially attempting the impossible, painting the fourth dimension, which is time. By flattening the world into multi-angled fragmented forms, they could show you multiple viewpoints all at the exact same time. Take a look at Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon on your screen. This painting is widely considered the birth canal of modern abstraction. Look closely at the figures. You won't find any soft curves or realistic shadows here. The bodies are hacked into sharp, aggressive, overlapping geometric planes. The background and foreground violently merge together. Look at the figure on the bottom right. She's facing away from us, yet her head twists around to stare directly at us. Picasso isn't just painting a static scene, he's recording the actual experience of moving around his subjects over a period of time.
To truly grasp how revolutionary this was, compare the old way, a traditional single static eye viewing a fixed window, to the cubist approach of multiple points of view over time. By 1910, this whole concept had evolved into what we call analytical cubism. Look at the Georges Braque painting we have up now. Notice how Braque strips away all the bright, pretty colors, relying purely on these dull browns and grays. He has completely dissolved the subject into a crystalline grid of interlocking facets. It's a cold, clinical, almost mathematical deconstruction of the physical world.
So, why did they adopt this cold, clinical approach? Well, it directly reflected the profound spatial anxiety of the era. In pre-war Paris, the intellectual elite were downright obsessed with the changing nature of reality. They felt a distinct loss of stable footing. Space was no longer seen as a safe, absolute constant. Instead, it was now viewed as fragmented, technological, and deeply, deeply unstable. Cubism unmasked the physical world, breaking it down into raw data and geometry. It was the absolute visual manifestation of a society realizing that the ground beneath them was fundamentally shifting.
Moving on to Part 2. Futurism and the Cult of Speed.
Meanwhile, across the Alps, Italy was deeply frustrated. They were tired of their reputation as Europe's dusty Renaissance museum. A group of angry, young intellectuals saw Cubism's visual fragmentation over in France and decided to completely weaponize it. They wanted to apply this artistic fragmentation to real-world motion, raw energy, and the absolute clamor of the modern city. This was Futurism, launched in 1909. It was spearheaded by the fiery poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, a man who, by the way, once famously got into a literal fistfight to defend his avant-garde poetry.
The movement launched with a blazing manifesto right on the front page of a major French newspaper, openly declaring a desire to burn down the libraries, flood the museums, and celebrate the glorious, roaring dawn of the machine age.
Marinetti famously wrote, "We declare that the splendor of the world has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A roaring motor car is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace." They were literally declaring, on the record, that a modern engine was more aesthetically perfect than the absolute greatest classical sculptures of antiquity. You can see this intense machine worship perfectly captured in Umberto Boccioni's bronze sculpture, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, shown here. Notice how Boccioni isn't sculpting human flesh, not at all. He is sculpting pure kinetic energy moving through space. The figure looks like a sleek turbine engine, or maybe a highly polished piston, just striding aggressively forward into a fully mechanized future.
But how exactly did they capture all this dynamic energy on a perfectly flat canvas? Well, the Futurists basically adapted the visual techniques of Cubism, but they injected them with pure adrenaline. They borrowed those fragmented planes we talked about, but then they integrated these aggressive force lines that just slashed violently across the canvas. They utilized heavy repetition to simulate rapid motion, and their subject matter. They completely abandoned traditional portraits. Instead, they favored industrial cities, electricity, and roaring trains. This aggressive optimism totally explodes in works like Giacomo Balla's Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash. Looking at it, Balla manages to capture the frantic, chaotic blur of movement, making the static canvas feel absolutely alive with kinetic energy.
Part 3. Cubism versus Futurism, a visual collision.
Now, while both movements heavily utilized geometric fragmentation, literally breaking the world down into geometric planes, their underlying cultural motivations were radically divergent. One was a tool for intellectual analysis, the other was a weapon for cultural revolution. Just look at the comparison table here to see their core philosophies side by side. Cubism in France deconstructed space and time, whereas Futurism in Italy passionately celebrated speed and modernization. To the French Cubists, the machine was merely an analytical tool, kind of a metaphor for a complex new reality, but to the Italian Futurists, it was an idol to worship. It was a literal weapon to destroy the old world. Ultimately, France was driven by a profound intellectual anxiety, while Italy was fueled by an aggressive, technophilic nationalism and a deep, deep lust for chaos.
And this leads us to the terrifying, truly apocalyptic underbelly of Futurism. In that exact same 1909 manifesto, Marinetti wrote, "We want to glorify war, the only hygiene of the world." Let that sink in. The Futurists didn't just want to paint pictures of machines. They craved a violent, cataclysmic event to cleanse Europe of its stagnant culture. They framed their desire for war as the ultimate industrial artwork, a magnificent stage where flawless, powerful machines would finally triumph over weak, fragile human flesh. Make no mistake, this was a deeply dangerous ideology, just masked as avant-garde art.
Which brings us to Part 4. The reality of mechanized war.
In August of 1914, the Futurists got exactly what they wished for, the absolute first fully mechanized conflict in human history. But the glorious machines they so blindly idolized, the heavy tanks rolling over exploded landscapes in the archival footage we see from World War I, they were nothing more than cold, unfeeling slaughterhouses. The conceptual fragmentation that these artists had explored so safely on their studio canvases suddenly became a horrifying physical reality. Human bodies and centuries-old landscapes were no longer just being intellectually shattered into geometric planes by a painter's brush. No, they were being literally, physically shattered by flying industrial shrapnel. The abstraction of the canvas had fully bled out into the mud of the trenches.
Let's trace this rapid, tragic timeline together, from the birth of theoretical modern art right up to its fatal collision with reality. In 1907, Cubism begins its deconstruction of reality in Paris. By 1909, the Futurist Manifesto is published, accelerating this fragmentation into an aggressive, nationalistic ideology. Just 5 years later, in 1914, the outbreak of mechanized World War I changes everything. The Great War absolutely crippled both of these artistic movements. The French cubist Georges Braque was sent to the front lines and actually suffered a severe head wound. And the Italian Futurists, who so eagerly volunteered to fight for their glorious mechanical war, they met incredibly tragic ends. In 1916, Umberto Boccioni, the masterful sculptor of speed we just studied, was thrown from a horse during a military exercise and trampled to death. The machine age had quite literally consumed its greatest admirers.
These artistic movements acted as civilization's early warning radar for total war. They literally sensed the fracturing of reality long before the politicians or the generals ever did. So, as we wrap up today, we must ask ourselves, is the futurist worship of speed a dangerous historical warning? Or does it perfectly mirror our own modern obsession with relentless digital disruption? Think deeply about how our own era's technology might be fracturing reality today. Keep that in mind, because in our next class, we're going to explore the artistic rebellion born directly from the ashes of those very trenches. Dada. Thank you for your attention.